She scrubbed the schoolhouse floor on her hands and knees while the whole town whispered behind their hands. They called her graceless, unfeminine, a woman built wrong for the world she lived in. Ruth McAllister had given everything to the children nobody else wanted, and the only reward she ever received was quiet contempt. Then one gray autumn morning, a solitary rancher walked past the schoolyard, said nothing, and changed the entire course of her life. Not with grand speeches or shining promises, but with something far rarer in this world. He simply showed up. Drop a comment below and tell us what city you are watching from. Stay with us to the very end, because this story is going to break your heart before it heals it completely. The autumn that descended on Red Willow that year was not the kind poets write about. There were no golden honeyed afternoons. There were no gentle crimson leaves drifting lazily down onto quiet country lanes. The autumn that came to Red Willow in the year of our story arrived the way hardship always arrives. In a frontier town, which is to say, it came early, it came mean, and it came without any apology whatsoever. The sky turned the color of old pewter sometime around the middle of September and simply stayed that way as though the sun itself had grown tired of the effort. The wind came raking down off the high plains with a cold, personal kind of hostility, rattling the loose shutters on the storefronts along Main Street and finding every gap and crack in every wall in every building in town. The cottonwoods along the creek turned a brittle, sickly yellow and shed their leaves not in any graceful cascade, but in anxious, rattling clusters, stripped bare almost overnight, left standing like gaunt, black-fingered skeletons against that unforgiving gray sky. It was into this particular autumn, in this particular town, that we must first find Ruth McAllister. She was already at the schoolhouse before first light. She was always at the schoolhouse before first light. This was not a fact that anyone in Red Willow remarked upon with admiration, though perhaps they should have. They did not remark upon it because it had simply become an accepted feature of the local landscape, the way the water tower at the edge of town and the leaning fence post at the Hendersons' property line were accepted features. Ruth McAllister arrived before anyone else and left after everyone had gone. That was simply the way of things. The schoolhouse itself was a source of ongoing civic embarrassment that the town council preferred not to examine too closely. It had been built 2 decades prior with the kind of optimistic enthusiasm that sometimes briefly seizes frontier communities, and it had been neglected with the kind of grinding, consistent indifference that invariably follows. The roof leaked in 3 places when it rained heavily. 2 of the windows on the eastern wall had lost their glass to a hailstorm the previous spring and had been patched with oilskin that did the job only poorly. The floorboards along the back wall had developed a softness that suggested something deeply troubling was happening to the joists beneath them. The cast-iron stove that served as the building's sole source of heat was a temperamental ancient thing that required a particular combination of skill, patience, and what Ruth privately referred to as firm negotiation, to coax into producing anything resembling reliable warmth. Ruth knew every one of these problems intimately and personally. She knew them because she had spent the better part of 3 years addressing them with her own 2 hands, her own small salary, and a stubbornness that her Eastern relatives had in their most recent batch of letters described as deeply unbecoming in a woman of her age. She was 28 years old that autumn. She was what the more charitable residents of Red Willow described as a large woman, and what the less charitable ones described in terms she had trained herself not to repeat even silently in the privacy of her own mind. She was tall, standing nearly a full head above most of the men she encountered, with the kind of broad, powerful frame that spoke plainly of generations of hard physical labor in her bloodline. Her shoulders were wide and strong. Her hands, even at 28, carried the roughened, calloused quality of someone who had spent years in direct, uncompromising contact with the physical world. She was not soft anywhere. She had never been allowed to be soft anywhere. Life in Red Willow and the years that had preceded her arrival in Red Willow had seen to that with considerable thoroughness. Her face was what her Aunt Cecilia in Baltimore had once described in a letter that Ruth had read twice before folding it very carefully and placing it at the bottom of her trunk as lacking in refinement. It was a broad, open, honest face. The nose had been broken once in childhood and had healed with a slight leftward lean that gave it a kind of blunt, practical character. Her eyes were a deep, steady gray-green, the color of sage after a rain, and they held in them a quality of quiet, focused intelligence that some people found disconcerting and a very few people found entirely captivating. Her hair was dark brown and thick, and she wore it pinned back with a no-nonsense practicality that her aunt had also commented upon unfavorably, suggesting it made her look. And here Ruth always had to take a slow, careful breath when she recalled this particular phrase, like a woman who had given up on herself. Ruth had not given up on herself. She had simply redirected. She redirected every instinct toward tenderness, every pocket of warmth in her considerable interior landscape toward the children. They were the reason she had come to Red Willow. They were the reason she stayed. Specifically, she had come because of the particular nature of Red Willow's student population, which included, at any given time, somewhere between 8 and 14 children who existed in that peculiarly invisible category of frontier childhood defined by the absence of adequate adult protection. Orphans in the full sense. Half-orphans. Children whose surviving parent had simply stopped managing, destroyed by drink or grief or the relentless grinding pressure of poverty, and who arrived at school each morning in varying states of physical neglect that Ruth found quietly heartbreaking every single day, without exception. She saw herself in them. That was the plain truth of it, and Ruth had always preferred plain truth to decorated fiction. She had been one of them in all the ways that mattered most. Not technically an orphan, but she had grown up in a household where she had been made to feel like an intruder in her own life. Too large, too loud, too sturdy. Too much of everything the women around her were not, and too little of everything they were. She had learned early that the world had a particular template for what a girl was supposed to look like, and sound like, and take up space like, and she had understood with the devastating clarity that sometimes visits children that she did not fit that template in any meaningful way. So she had built her own template. She had poured herself into books and then into teaching, and she had come to Red Willow because someone had told her they needed a teacher badly enough that they would take anyone willing to make the journey, and because she had heard from a woman at a church social in Laramie that there were children in Red Willow who came to school hungry and frightened and stayed only because the schoolhouse was warmer than wherever they had come from. Those children were the ones Ruth had come for. Those were the ones she stayed for. Every cracked floorboard she patched, every pane of glass she replaced with money she had saved by eating beans 3 nights running instead of anything more substantial. Every piece of firewood she split herself in the schoolyard on Saturday mornings with the borrowed axe from the livery stable was done with those children specifically in mind. The town council knew this in the vague and uncomfortable way that people know things they would prefer not to have to act upon. They knew she worked harder than any teacher they had ever hired. They knew the children attended more regularly under her supervision than they had under any previous arrangement. They knew the building, while still in chronic need of serious structural attention, they had no intention of providing was considerably more functional than it had been 3 years ago. They knew all of this, and they compensated her accordingly, which is to say they paid her a salary that was slightly less than what they had paid her male predecessor, despite the fact that her male predecessor had lasted 14 months before departing for California without giving notice, and they spoke about her in the particular tone of conditional tolerance that was the closest they were capable of coming to gratitude. The children did not speak about her in that tone. The children, the hungry ones and the frightened ones and the ones who showed up in November without adequate coats, spoke about Miss McAllister in the only tone that mattered, which was the tone of uncomplicated total trust. They brought her their broken things, their scrapes and bruises, their incomprehensible arithmetic problems, and their night fears, and their small, shameful secrets, and she received all of it with the same steady, unhurried attention. She remembered every one of their names. She remembered their birthdays. She remembered which ones woke screaming from nightmares, and which ones went very quiet when they were frightened, because quiet was sometimes more dangerous than screaming, and she had learned to watch for it. She had 5 children boarding with her that autumn in the small 2-room dwelling attached to the back of the schoolhouse that served as her residence. This arrangement was not officially sanctioned by the town council, a fact that everyone involved understood implicitly, and that was maintained through the mutual agreement never to discuss it directly. There was Thomas, who was 9 and had not spoken more than a dozen words since his mother died of a fever the previous spring, but who had recently begun tentatively to draw horses in the margins of his copybook with a talent that Ruth found genuinely moving. There was the Briggs sisters, Clara and May, 7 and 5 respectively, whose father had ridden out 6 months ago to look for work and had not come back, and who slept curled together like 2 halves of a single animal in the narrow bed in the corner. There was Eli, 11, who had a ferocious, undisciplined intelligence and a habit of asking questions that the town's adults found inconvenient, and who had been sent to Ruth after the 4th family in 3 years had returned him to the circuit preacher's care, with the explanation that he was too difficult. And there was little Nora, who was only 4 and technically too young for school, who had simply appeared at the schoolhouse door one morning in August with a rag doll and no explanation, and no one in town who could account for where she had come from, and who had attached herself to Ruth's left leg with the fixed determination of a small person who has finally found a thing she intends to keep. Ruth fed all of them. She bathed all of them. She read to all of them at night by lamplight, doing different voices for different characters with a theatrical commitment that secretly delighted her and that she would have been deeply embarrassed to perform before any adult audience. She mended their clothes and held them when they cried and sat with them in the dark when the dark became too much. She did all of this on a salary that did not technically permit it by managing her own needs down to a level of austerity that had become over time simply the texture of her daily existence. She ate what was left. She slept what hours remained. She wore the same 2 dresses in rotation, both of them mended so many times that the mending itself had become a kind of patchwork record of the years. She did not think of herself as sacrificing anything, which was perhaps the most remarkable thing about her. She thought of herself as finally at last doing the thing she was built to do. On the morning our story properly begins, Ruth was in the schoolyard at 6:30 confronting a problem that had been building for the better part of 2 weeks. A large cottonwood along the fence line, weakened by the previous season's drought, and then by a particularly vicious windstorm 3 nights ago, had come down across the corner of the schoolyard with a tremendous crash at approximately 2 in the morning. Demolishing 8 feet of the fence, flattening the small kitchen garden, Ruth had spent considerable effort establishing along the south wall and depositing a section of trunk and a snarl of heavy branches directly in the path between the schoolhouse door and the outhouse, which was a problem of a more immediate practical nature. She had tried to get the town council to send someone out to deal with it. She had submitted a written request as required by council protocol 4 days ago. She had received a brief written response informing her that the matter would be placed on the agenda for the next regular meeting, which was scheduled for the following Thursday, at which time a decision regarding appropriate action would be made and communicated to her in writing within 10 business days of said meeting. Ruth had read this response with the careful composure of someone who has had a great deal of practice managing her reactions to institutional indifference, folded it neatly, placed it in the drawer with the 17 other similar communications she had received over the past 3 years, and gone back to the problem of the fallen tree. The main trunk section was roughly 18 inches in diameter and perhaps 9 feet long, which meant it weighed somewhere in the vicinity of several hundred pounds. This was beyond what Ruth could move alone by direct lifting, a fact she had established experimentally over the past 2 mornings and accepted without excessive drama. What she had been working on methodically was a system of leverage. She had found 2 good solid fence rails in the wreckage and had positioned them as levers. She had moved several of the smaller branch sections out of the way by brute force, stacking them along the fence line to be dealt with later. She was currently focused on the problem of getting enough purchase on the main trunk to shift it far enough that the children could get to the outhouse without navigating around it, which was her immediate practical objective. The morning was cold and gray and very still. Her breath made clouds in the air in front of her face. She had her coat off and her sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold, because she had learned over years of physical work that warmth was something you generated yourself and that bulky sleeves caught on things at inconvenient moments. She was working the longer of the 2 fence rails into position under the trunk, trying to find an angle that would give her sufficient mechanical advantage when she heard the sound of hooves on the road that passed the schoolyard fence. She did not look up. She was at a critical point in the positioning of the lever, and looking up would cost her the angle. She heard the hooves slow and then stop. She heard the creak of saddle leather that indicated someone dismounting. She continued working. Then, without any preamble, without any announcement of his presence or his intentions, a second pair of hands appeared on the fence rail beside hers. Large hands, work-roughened, deeply tanned, capable-looking hands. They found a grip, perhaps 18 inches from her own. And without a single word being spoken, a broad pair of shoulders appeared beside her own broad shoulders, and the combined weight of 2 people applied itself to the lever. The trunk shifted. It moved perhaps 1.5 feet, rolling slightly in the direction of the fence line, clearing the path. Ruth straightened up and looked at the man beside her for the first time. He was perhaps 10 years older than she, was lean in the particular way of people who work hard outdoors in all weathers, with a face that had been so thoroughly weathered by wind and sun that it had settled into a kind of permanent angular stillness. Dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. Eyes the particular dark, quiet brown of creek water in shadow. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the trunk, assessing the remaining problem with what appeared to be the same methodical, practical attention she had been applying to it for the past 2 mornings. He picked up the second fence rail. He moved to the other side of the trunk. He looked at her with a brief, neutral expression that contained in it a question, and she understood the question without its being spoken, and she moved to her side of the trunk with the first rail, and they applied the levers simultaneously, and the trunk rolled another 18 inches, and then another, until it was fully clear of the path, and resting against the fence line, where it would be out of the way until she could figure out what to do with it more permanently. He set down his fence rail. He looked at the remaining branches with the same assessing expression. He picked up the larger ones one at a time and stacked them with the others she had already moved, working with a quiet economy of motion that she recognized as the physical language of someone who does not waste energy on unnecessary movement. When the last branch was stacked, he dusted his hands against his trousers, retrieved his hat from where he had set it on the fence post, and put it back on his head. He looked at her. "Jesse Hardin," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "Ruth McAllister," she said. He nodded once as though this confirmed something. He walked back to his horse, mounted without evident effort, and rode on down the road. Ruth stood in the cleared schoolyard for a long moment, her breath clouding in the cold air, looking after him. Then she picked up her coat from where she had laid it over the fence and put it back on. She had a stove to light and 5 children to get fed before 7:30. She did not think about Jesse Hardin for the rest of the morning. Or rather, she thought about him in the occasional peripheral way one thinks about an unexpected phenomenon that doesn't yet have a category, a presence registered but not yet understood, filed temporarily in the section of one's awareness, labeled things to be examined later when there is time, which for Ruth meant probably never. The morning was the usual managed chaos of feeding 5 children of varying ages on a schedule that had to align with the arrival of the 11 other students who came from town and from the farms along the creek road, a population that ranged from 6 to 14 years old and included the full spectrum from Eli's blazing inconvenient intelligence to the genuine and probably irreversible academic indifference of the Putnam boys, twins of 12, who had apparently made a collective decision at some prior point in their lives that the mental and physical effort required by literacy was simply not a trade they were willing to make. Ruth taught all of them in the same room with the same stove and the same 3 cracked blackboards, dividing her attention and her energy and her patience into portions that somehow, through some alchemy she couldn't fully account for, seemed to be approximately sufficient for all of them. She believed with a conviction she had arrived at through experience rather than sentiment that every child in that room was capable of more than they had been told they were. Even the Putnam boys. Even she suspected in ways that would reveal themselves only over the very long term. Thomas, who had not yet spoken in her presence but whose horse drawings had developed over the past 3 weeks a fluid muscular accuracy that she found quietly extraordinary. She also believed with an equal conviction arrived at through equally direct experience that the town council of Red Willow shared absolutely none of these views, and that this disagreement was not a minor philosophical difference, but rather the central load-bearing conflict of her professional life in this particular place. The council's position, as Ruth had been able to reconstruct it from 3 years of interactions, could be summarized approximately as follows. The school existed because the territorial government required that schools exist in communities of a certain size and withheld certain funding arrangements from communities that failed to maintain them. The children it served were categorized implicitly but unmistakably into 2 groups. There were the children whose parents paid taxes and sat on committees and held social positions, who were the children the school was primarily considered to exist for. And then there were the other children, the ones without adequate adult protection, who were viewed by a significant faction of the council as an unfortunate drain on limited resources, rather than as human beings with futures worth investing in. Ruth's particular and passionate commitment to the second group was something the council had communicated its discomfort with on several occasions, most recently at the September meeting, where Councilman Aldrich, who was the faction's most forthright spokesman, had characterized her approach as, and she was quoting from memory here, encouraging dependency among individuals who would be better served by learning early the necessity of self-sufficiency, by which he meant, as Ruth had understood perfectly well, and Aldrich had known she understood, that the children would be better off learning to work as cheap labor on local farms than receiving an education that might give them ideas above their appropriate station. She had responded to this at some length and with a precision that she was not entirely certain had served her long-term diplomatic interests in the room, but that had felt at the time entirely necessary. Aldrich had not forgiven her for it. This was evident in every subsequent interaction and in the studied coolness with which the council now conducted its communications with her. The formal written protocols, the 10-business-day response timelines, the careful avoidance of any direct engagement that might require them to look her in the eye. She was thinking about Aldrich actually that afternoon while she was splitting firewood in the schoolyard after the students had gone home. She was thinking about him in the particular focused way one thinks about an obstacle that must be gotten around, trying to identify the approach that would be most effective and least likely to result in her being fired before she had secured some kind of alternative arrangement for the 5 children sleeping under her roof. She had the axe in a rhythm, one of those physical rhythms where the body manages itself and the mind can run freely on a parallel track, when she heard the wagon come into the schoolyard. She straightened and turned. It was a simple farm wagon driven by a boy of perhaps 14 she didn't recognize, loaded with split firewood. The boy pulled up, set the brake, climbed down, and began unloading. "Excuse me," Ruth said. "There must be some mistake. I didn't order firewood." The boy, who was occupied with stacking wood against the schoolhouse wall with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before, glanced at her briefly over his shoulder. "No mistake, ma'am," he said. "Mr. Hardin said bring it." Ruth stood with the axe in her hand for a moment. "Mr. Hardin," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Jesse Hardin." "Yes, ma'am. Said to bring a load for the school and another every 2 weeks until spring." The boy went back to stacking. Ruth opened her mouth and then closed it again. She looked at the firewood being stacked with methodical competence against the wall of her schoolhouse. She looked at the axe in her hand, which had been dealing perfectly adequately with the problem, or so she had believed. She looked back at the firewood. She set the axe down against the fence post. She watched the boy finish the stacking climb back up onto the wagon and turn the horses for the road. She did not say anything. There did not seem to be anything particular to say. Jesse Hardin was not present to receive any response she might have formulated, and the boy's expression suggested that he was functioning purely as a delivery mechanism and had no further information to offer. She stood in the cooling afternoon air and looked at the stacked wood for a long moment, and then she went back inside to help Clara with her letters. That evening, after the children were in bed, she sat at the table in the small attached room with the lamp turned low and wrote the letter she wrote to herself every few months, the one that existed only in her head, and that she never put on paper, the one that was a kind of accounting of her position in the world. She did this not from a habit of self-pity, but from a habit of honesty, because she believed that clarity about one's actual situation was a prerequisite for doing anything useful about it, and because she had long since learned that the alternative to this particular kind of honest internal accounting was a creeping unreality that she found genuinely frightening. Her position in the world was as follows. She was 28 years old. She was employed in a capacity that was tenuous and subject to the goodwill of people who did not wish her especially well. She was physically imposing in ways that her society, with its very particular ideas about what a woman's body was supposed to look like and communicate, registered as a deficiency rather than a strength. She had been told this clearly enough, and often enough, by relatives and by strangers and by the accumulated weight of 1,000 small signals transmitted through 1,000 different interactions, that she had a long time ago stopped arguing with it as a description of how the world perceived her, even as she continued stubbornly and perhaps irrationally to believe that the world was wrong. She had no suitors. She had not had suitors. This was not a situation she had arrived at through lack of interest in the abstract concept of partnership, because she was honest enough to acknowledge that the abstract concept held considerable appeal, but through a combination of realistic assessment of her own social position and a pride that would not permit her to seek or accept an arrangement premised on settling or on the elaborate mutual pretense that she was something she was not. She would not be the large, plain, practical wife that a man took when he needed someone to do the work and had abandoned any expectation of the rest of it. She had seen that particular arrangement. She understood its interior. She wanted no part of it. What she had instead were the children, and she held to this not as a consolation, but as a genuine sufficiency, or tried to on most mornings with varying degrees of success, depending on the morning. She blew out the lamp and sat for a while in the dark, listening to the sounds of 5 children sleeping in the next room, which were the sounds of small people utterly at rest in the belief that someone competent was watching over them. And she thought about the firewood stacked against the wall outside, and about a pair of work-roughened hands appearing beside hers on a fence rail without any preceding announcement or subsequent explanation, and she decided that this was on balance a thing she did not yet know what to make of. She went to bed. Outside, the wind had come up again, finding the gaps in the walls of the schoolhouse, with that particular relentless attention it had been paying to red willow for the past several weeks, testing the structure for weaknesses the way all the pressures of the world tend to do when they sense that a thing is holding on by narrower margins than it would like anyone to know. Inside, in the dark, in the small room attached to the schoolhouse, Ruth McAllister lay on her narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and breathed in the smell of chalk dust and wood smoke, and 5 children, and the particular austere life she had built with her own 2 hands in this hard, unforgiving ash-gray frontier. Autumn, and she thought with the stubborn, quiet ferocity that was perhaps her most defining characteristic that she was not finished yet. Not remotely, not even close. The town of Red Willow did not know this about her. Not fully, not yet. The town council certainly did not know it. They had looked at her and seen what they expected to see. A large, plain, inconvenient woman doing a necessary job in a less than ideal way, a placeholder to be managed and eventually replaced. They had looked, and they had not seen what was actually there, which was a woman of formidable internal architecture. A woman who had been built by every difficulty she had survived into something considerably stronger and more durable than the world had intended when it handed her those difficulties. A woman who was in the particular way of people who have been pushed far enough and held their ground anyway, just barely getting started. She closed her eyes. In the morning there were children to feed. The firewood appeared again 2 weeks later, exactly as the boy had said it would. Ruth was inside when it arrived this time, listening to Eli read aloud from the geography primer with the particular brand of impatient energy he brought to everything, his voice racing ahead of his comprehension in his eagerness to get to the end of the page. She heard the wagon in the yard and recognized the sound and continued listening to Eli read and did not go to the window. She had spent some portion of the intervening 2 weeks trying to decide how she felt about the arrangement and had arrived after considerable internal negotiation at a position she could live with, which was practical gratitude without obligation. The wood was for the children. She could accept it for the children without it meaning anything beyond that. This was a clean, workable arrangement, and she intended to maintain it. What she had not anticipated was that the arrangement would not remain at the level of firewood deliveries. It was a Thursday morning, 11 days after the first delivery, when Margaret Hollis came to the schoolhouse. Ruth knew Margaret Hollis by sight and by reputation. Her husband, Owen Hollis, was one of the more prosperous cattle operators in the valley, and one of Councilman Aldrich's more reliable allies, which told Ruth everything she needed to know about the general orientation of the household. Margaret Hollis was a small, precise woman of perhaps 45, with the kind of rigid, self-maintained bearing that speaks of a life organized around the enforcement of particular standards, and she arrived at the schoolhouse door at 10:30 on a Thursday morning with the expression of someone who has been building toward a confrontation for some time and has finally given themselves permission to have it. Ruth heard the door open while she was working with the younger children on their numbers at the front board. She heard the footsteps cross the floor. She turned. Margaret Hollis had positioned herself in the center of the room with her arms folded and her chin elevated at an angle that was intended to communicate authority. The children were all looking at her. Thomas at the back had stopped his drawing and was very still. The Briggs sisters had moved slightly closer together in their shared seat. Ruth recognized the stillness in the room for what it was and felt the familiar, careful management process engage in her chest, the one that kept her voice level and her expression neutral when every instinct was pulling in a different direction. "Mrs. Hollis," she said, "good morning. Is there something I can help you with? I'll speak plainly." Margaret Hollis said, and her voice was pitched to carry, which Ruth understood immediately was not accidental. She was performing this. The children were the audience. I have had 3 separate women in this valley tell me they are considering pulling their children from this school because of concerns about the example being set by its teacher. The room was absolutely silent. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. "What concerns specifically?" Ruth said, and her voice was level and quiet, which cost her more than anyone watching would have guessed. "Your manner," Margaret Hollis said, "your habits, the way you conduct yourself. A school teacher is supposed to model appropriate feminine behavior for the young girls in her care. What you model is something else entirely. She let her gaze travel over Ruth with the deliberate top-to-bottom assessment of someone making an appraisal and finding the object wanting. You split your own wood like a field hand. You haul lumber. You argue with men in public meetings. You have orphaned children living under your roof without any proper authority sanctioning it. You are, in the opinion of several of this town's most respectable women, a deeply unsuitable influence. Ruth kept her hands still at her sides. She was aware with a particular kind of focused awareness of every child in the room of Thomas at the back, who had gone so still he barely seemed to breathe, of little Nora at the front bench, who had turned and was looking at Ruth, with 4-year-old directness of Clara and May in their shared seat of Eli, who she could feel, without looking at him, vibrating with a tightly contained fury on her behalf that touched her more than she would have been able to express. She opened her mouth, and then she became aware of something she had not been aware of a moment before, which was that she was not the only adult standing in the room. She had not heard him come in. The door had been opened to the mild morning, and the sound of a hammer had been coming from somewhere along the back wall for the past 20 minutes, so steady and so naturally part of the room's ambient noise that she had stopped registering it. Jesse Hardin had been replacing the soft floorboards along the back wall with the quiet, methodical competence she was beginning to associate with him specifically, and he was still there, and he was now standing, and he was not large in the way of men who make a show of their size, but he was large in the way of a thing that is simply what it is, without any performance attached, and he was standing approximately 6 feet behind Margaret Hollis and slightly to her left. And he was looking at Margaret Hollis with an expression that was entirely still and entirely neutral, and somehow in its absolute stillness communicated something very clearly indeed. Margaret Hollis became aware of him. Ruth watched it happen. The woman's shoulders changed. The elevated chin dropped perhaps a 1/4 inch. She turned slightly, registered the presence behind her, and then turned back to Ruth. And what had been theatrical certainty was now something with a slightly different quality, still hard, but edged now with a faint, involuntary caution. Ruth looked at Jesse Hardin for one brief moment. He did not look back at her. He was looking at Margaret Hollis with that same quiet, unmovable attention. He did not say a word. He did not need to say a word. He was simply there present, and still a weight in the room that had not been there before. And his presence said, without any language required, that Ruth McAllister was not standing alone in this room, and that anyone who wished to continue this particular line of approach would be doing so with that fact fully in view. Ruth looked back at Margaret Hollis. "I teach these children to read and write and reckon figures," she said, and her voice was very steady. "I teach them geography and history and the natural sciences to the best of my ability and the extent of our materials. I teach them that their minds have value and that the world contains more than red willow. I have not, to my knowledge, taught any girl in this room that she is less than she is. I intend to continue doing exactly what I am doing. If certain families choose to withdraw their children from that education, I am sorry for the children." There was a silence. Margaret Hollis looked at her for a long moment, and then her gaze went briefly, involuntarily, to Jesse Hardin, and then she looked back at Ruth, and then she turned and walked out of the schoolhouse without another word. The door swung shut behind her. The wind had come up again outside, and they could hear her wagon on the road. Ruth turned back to the class. Every single child was looking at her with the wide, held-breath attention of witnesses to something they had not yet processed. She let the moment hold for 3 full seconds, which was what it needed. Then she turned to the blackboard, picked up the chalk, and said in her normal instructional voice, "Eli, continue from where you left off." There was a beat. Then Eli's voice resumed and the room breathed again, and after a moment or two the ambient sounds of learning reestablished themselves, and Ruth stood at the board and made herself focus on the numbers she was writing while the adrenaline worked itself through her system with the slowness of things that have nowhere particular to go. She did not look at Jesse Hardin again until the midday break, when the older children were outside and the little ones were eating at the front bench. She walked to the back of the room. He was on his knees examining the last section of damaged floor, pressing the boards with his palm to test them, and he glanced up at her with that brief, neutral expression that she had already catalogued as his default. "How long has this section been like this?" he asked. "Since last winter," she said. "The council has it on the agenda." He made a brief sound that was not quite a word and pressed another board. "I'll need to come back Saturday to finish this side. The joists under here need blocking." Ruth looked at him for a moment. She thought about saying several different things and then said the one that felt most honest. "You didn't have to stay." He looked up at her again. The look held for a moment without either of them speaking, and then he said, "No, I didn't." And that was all he said. He went back to examining the floor. Ruth stood there for a moment longer, and then she went back to the front of the room to supervise the children's lunch, and she did not look at him again because she had determined that looking at him was becoming a habit she needed to monitor. She had spent most of her adult life being extremely careful about what she allowed herself to want. Wanting things that were unlikely to be available to her was a practice she had learned early to discipline out of herself, because she had found through the practical experience of several years of living in her own specific body and her own specific social position that the distance between wanting and having was for her almost always wider than it was for other people, and that developing a taste for that particular specific width of disappointment was not something she could afford. She had applied this discipline consistently, and she had gotten over time fairly good at it. Jesse Hardin was presenting a problem with this system. The problem was not what she might have expected it to be. It was not that she found him handsome, though she found him handsome in the plain, uncomplicated way she found a well-made tool or a well-built fence. Handsome, which is to say the handsomeness, was an aspect of the thing's evident fitness for its purpose, rather than a quality imposed from outside. The problem was not that he was kind to her, because what he was not exactly kindness in the way she usually understood it, not the careful, performative consideration of someone managing a delicate situation. What he was something closer to straightforward. He treated her as a person engaged in work that deserved to be taken seriously, and he assisted that work when his assistance was useful, and he did not make any of this into a production or attach to it any visible expectation of credit or return, and she found that she had no established category in which to place this behavior, and that the absence of a category was creating a kind of low-level interference in the smooth running of her daily operations. She was aware that this was a significant problem. She was also aware with the part of herself that remained an honest assessor of situations, regardless of how inconvenient the assessment was, that the problem was getting slightly more significant each time he appeared in the schoolyard. The Saturday session to fix the joists lasted the better part of the day. Ruth was in and out of the schoolhouse on her own work, and he would ask her a question about what she needed from a particular section of floor, and she would answer it, and they would both go back to their respective tasks, and by late afternoon the floor along the back wall was solid, and Ruth stood on it and tested it with her weight, and felt the difference immediately, that absolute ungiving reliability where there had been soft uncertainty, and she looked at it, and then looked at Jesse, who was putting his tools back in the canvas roll he carried, and said, "What do I owe you for the wood and the work?" He didn't look up from the tools. "Nothing." "That's not acceptable," Ruth said. She kept her voice even. He did look up then. Why not? She thought about it honestly for a moment, which was her habit with questions that deserved honesty. "Because I need to know what it means," she said. What I owe and to whom is information I need in order to function correctly. There was a pause. He considered her answer with the same seriousness she had put into giving it. Then he said, "All right. Tell me what those children need before winter that they don't have." Ruth looked at him. This was not what she had been prepared for. He was looking at her steadily, with those creek-water brown eyes waiting, and she understood that this was a real question, and that he expected a real answer, and she felt something shift in her chest with a movement she registered but did not examine closely. She told him. She told him about the window on the east wall that was still oilskin, and that she had been putting off replacing because the glass had to come from the supply store in Millhaven, and she hadn't been able to spare the freight cost. She told him about Thomas, who had outgrown his coat and was wearing one with sleeves that ended at his mid-forearm, and that she had extended twice already with panels cut from an old blanket. She told him about the arithmetic primers, 3 of which had lost their covers and were shedding pages at a rate that was going to render them unusable by spring. She told him these things in the straightforward, practical way she enumerated problems that needed solving without either minimizing or dramatizing them, and when she was done, she stopped and waited. Jesse had listened to all of it without interrupting. He had listened the way he did most things, with a quality of stillness and focused attention that made her feel in a way she was not accustomed to feeling when speaking to adults that she was being heard. "I'll get the glass from Millhaven next time I go in," he said. "I know someone with a coat Thomas can have. Give me the page numbers from the primers, and I'll see what I can do." Ruth opened her mouth and then closed it. She had been prepared to argue about payment arrangements, and he had entirely bypassed the premise of the negotiation. "You don't know these children," she said. It came out slightly less composed than she intended. "No," he agreed, "but you do." He finished rolling the tools and stood up, and Ruth stood there in the schoolhouse with the solid new floor under her feet and the late afternoon light coming through the oilskin window in that particular pale gold way it had in October, and she felt something happening in the vicinity of her sternum that she decided firmly and with great practicality she was not going to name. "Thank you," she said instead, because it was true and because it was safe. He nodded once in that way he had, the way that acknowledged receipt without making a production of it, and he picked up his tools and went out. Ruth stood alone in the empty schoolhouse for a long moment. Keisha. She could hear the children in the attached room, Clara reading to May from the book of illustrated fables Ruth had found at the back of the supply shelf in Millhaven and brought home as a specific gift for May, who loved animals with an intensity of feeling she expressed almost entirely through the quality of her listening. She could hear Eli in the yard, probably conducting some private experiment related to the current running through his mind, which this week appeared to involve the physics of levers, a subject Ruth had addressed directly in class, with, she suspected, the unintended consequence of providing him with theoretical frameworks for activities she would prefer he not undertake. She could hear Nora somewhere close singing to herself in the wordless, tuneless way she had. She could hear all of them, and the floor was solid under her, and the woodpile outside was well stocked, and she thought about Jesse Hardin's hands on the fence rail that first gray morning, and about the quality of silence that he carried with him, the way some men carry noise, and about the way he had stood behind Margaret Hollis without saying a single word, a mountain that had simply arranged itself between a storm and the thing the storm intended to damage. She thought about all of this, and then she went to help Clara with May's bath, because there were children to see to, and the day was not finished, and she was, as she had always been, a woman of practical action rather than extended contemplation. But that evening, after the lamp was out and the children were sleeping, she lay on her narrow bed in the dark, and was honest with herself in the way she permitted herself to be only in the dark, only in the privacy of the hours between waking and sleep, when the disciplined management of wanting briefly relaxed its vigilance. She was 28 years old and she was lonely in a way that went deeper than the absence of any particular person. She was lonely in the structural way, in the way of a life that had been built entirely for giving and had made no provision anywhere in its architecture for the possibility of receiving. She had built it this way deliberately, or at least she had told herself it was deliberate, because the alternative was building and provisions for receiving and then watching those provisions go unused, which she had decided was a worse loneliness than the one she had. She had been so certain of this for so long that she had stopped examining the certainty, had simply accepted it, the way one accepts a load-bearing wall as something that cannot be touched without risking the structure. And now there was a man who brought firewood and fixed floors and stood without announcement or apparent expectation between her and the people who wished her harm, and he asked her what the children needed with the absolute seriousness of someone who intended to do something about the answer, and she did not know what category to put him in, and the absence of the category was starting to feel like something she would not be able to continue managing. She was afraid. She knew the architecture of this particular fear well enough to call it by its name, which was the fear of being seen accurately. Not the fear of being seen as deficient, because she had lived with that her whole life and had found ways to carry it. The fear of being seen as she actually was capable of wanting. Capable of being hurt by the wanting, capable of the specific vulnerability of a person who hopes. That was the one she had no good defenses for. She turned on her side and pulled the blanket up and listened to the wind testing the schoolhouse walls and to 5 children breathing in the next room. Outside, somewhere down the road in the direction of the Hardin ranch, a light was still burning. She did not know this with certainty, but she thought it might be. In the morning, the glass for the east window was leaning against the schoolhouse door, wrapped carefully in burlap, with a small boy's winter coat folded on top of it, and on top of the coat a note written in a plain, direct hand that said, "Only Thomas can keep it." Ruth stood in the doorway in the cold morning air and held the coat and looked at the handwriting on the note for a long moment, and then she went inside and woke the children for breakfast, and when Thomas came to the table, she handed him the coat without explanation, and when he put it on, and his hands went all the way to the ends of the sleeves, and his face did the thing it did when he was working on a drawing that was coming out right, which was go very still and very open in a way that looked like wonder. Ruth turned away and focused on the porridge so that none of the children would see her expression, which would have told them more than she was ready to say. The days continued to shorten. The cold deepened. October moved toward November with the particular deliberate heaviness of a season that knows what it is bringing. Jesse Hardin came to the schoolhouse 9 more times before the blizzard. Ruth counted this not obsessively, but honestly, because she had determined that honesty was her only viable navigation tool, and the counting was part of the honesty. He came to finish the flooring, and then he came to reglaze the east window, and then he came because the stovepipe had developed a separation at the second joint that was leaking smoke into the room, and that Ruth had been addressing by opening the door periodically, which worked poorly. He fixed the stovepipe with a competence that made the repair look effortless, which Ruth recognized as the signature of someone who had done a great deal of practical work over a great many years. Each time he came, they talked. Not at great length, and not in the way of people working through conversational performances for each other, but in the way of 2 people who are in the same space for a practical purpose and who find, without particularly intending to, that they have things to say to each other. She learned that he had come to Red Willow 14 years ago from a place considerably further south, and had built the ranch from land that had been considered unusable, which she gathered had been a significant part of its appeal for him. She learned that he had a brother in Kansas who he corresponded with regularly and got along with in the way of people who genuinely like each other and have organized their lives so as to avoid being in direct proximity. She learned that he read which she had not assumed, but which became evident when she mentioned a book she used with the older children, and he said something about it that was accurate and not general, the response of someone who had actually read the book rather than someone who had read about it. He learned things about her, too. She was not aware of exactly how much she was telling him until later, which was itself an indication of something, because she was normally quite careful about what she revealed. He learned about her aunt in Baltimore and the letters at the bottom of the trunk, not through any direct recounting, but through the way she spoke about the gap between what she had been told she was and what she had determined through evidence that she actually was. He learned about the specific quality of loneliness that comes from being a child who does not fit the template, not through any explicit confession, but because it was in everything she said about Thomas and about May and about the others, the deep personal recognition of a person identifying something they know from the inside. She did not know what he made of all this. His responses were always measured, always considered, never offered in the easy currency of reflexive reassurance, and this was simultaneously the quality of his listening that she found most trustworthy and the quality that made it most difficult to read him. She could not tell from the careful, neutral steadiness of his attention what he was actually thinking, and she was not accustomed to not being able to tell, and she was not sure whether this was a problem or not. What she was sure of by the first week of November was that the interference in her daily operations had not decreased. It had, in fact, increased to the point where she had stopped pretending to herself that it was a minor or manageable distraction, and had upgraded it in her honest internal accounting to the status of a genuine development requiring acknowledgement. She was also sure on the morning of November the 8th, when she woke to a sky the color of iron and a wind that had gone from sharp to something with a different, more absolute quality entirely, that something else was coming that would require her full attention. Because there was a smell in that wind, a cold, wet, imminent smell, and she had been on the frontier long enough to know what it meant. She was already building up the schoolhouse fire when the first flakes began to fall. The first flakes were small and polite, the kind that settle on coat sleeves and melt before you can look at them properly. Ruth watched them through the newly glazed east window while the children arrived for the morning session, and told herself it might amount to nothing. The sky said otherwise. The sky had that particular low iron-gray density that she had seen once before 2 winters ago, the week before the storm that had kept the valley road impassable for 11 days, and her body, which had always been a more reliable instrument than her wishful thinking, registered what the sky was saying, and began its quiet preparations independently of her conscious assessment. By 8 o'clock, the flakes were no longer small or polite. They were coming in sideways, driven by a wind that had found a new, more serious register, a sound less like weather and more like intention. 3 of the town children had not arrived, which meant their parents had looked at that sky and made the correct decision. The remaining 8 students were in their seats with their coats still on because the stove, despite Jesse's repair of the pipe, and Ruth's firm negotiation with its temperament that morning, was fighting a losing battle against the cold that was now pressing through every joint and gap in the schoolhouse walls. Ruth assessed the situation with the rapid, practical intelligence she brought to emergencies, which she understood this to be, even if it had not yet fully announced itself. She sent the 8 town children home before 9 o'clock, walking each group to the road herself, watching them go with the focused attention of someone mentally tracking trajectories. The Hanson children lived closest, and she watched them until they turned through their gate. The Putnam boys, whose farm was a half-mile further, she trusted to the specific survival instinct of 12-year-olds who have grown up on the frontier, which was reliable, if not elegant. That left her with Thomas and Eli, and Clara, and May, and Nora, the 5 who had nowhere else to go. She was bringing in the last of the wood from the porch stack, carrying it in armloads with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this many times when she heard a horse in the yard. She turned, squinting against the snow, which was now dense enough to reduce visibility to perhaps 30 yards, and Jesse Hardin came through the white curtain on his horse with the calm, purposeful look of a man who has assessed conditions and made a decision. He dismounted, tied the horse to the porch post, and looked at her over the armload of wood she was carrying with an expression that contained several things she did not have time to interpret. "The creek road is going under," he said. "I came through before it got worse." He looked at the wood in her arms and then at the porch stack, calculating. "How much is left?" "This is the last of the porch stack," she said. "There's another cord stacked against the side wall." He nodded and went for the side wall without further discussion. She went inside with the wood. This was how it went between them. Now she realized this easy, wordless division of necessary labor, neither of them performing consultation or asking permission, each simply taking the half of the problem that was in front of them. She had never had this with anyone before. She did not examine it now, because there was no time, but she registered it with the part of her that was always honest. By 10 o'clock, it was clear that they were not going anywhere. The storm had committed itself with a thoroughness that left no room for negotiation. The wind had gone from serious to something beyond serious, a constant driving assault that pressed the snow horizontally against the windows and created a sound against the schoolhouse walls that the children registered in their bodies before their minds processed it, a collective tightening, a drawing inward. Clara had May in her arms on the front bench. Thomas was in his seat at the back pencil, moving across his copybook in the fast, focused strokes he used when the world outside him became too much, retreating into the horses on the page. Eli was at the window cataloging the storm with the absorbed attention of a scientist, but Ruth could see in the set of his shoulders that even Eli's scientific detachment had limits, and they were being approached. Nora was attached to Ruth's left leg with her full, customary determination. Ruth made the assessment. The stove was maintaining barely. The wood situation with what Jesse was stacking on the porch in loads that he was bringing from the side wall stack, with a regularity that told her he had already made his own calculation about quantity versus duration, was adequate for the immediate present and uncertain beyond that. The children needed to eat. She had the emergency provisions she kept in the school kitchen for situations that required it. Not this specific situation. Nothing could have specifically anticipated this situation, but she had always known that living where she lived with the children she was responsible for meant being prepared for versions of this, and so there were dried beans and hard cornbread, and 2 tins of peaches, and a quantity of dried apple that she had put up herself in September. She fed them at midday, all 6 of them, including Jesse, who came in from the cold with snow in his hair and ice in the creases of his coat, and sat at the children's table without being asked, which struck her with a particular quiet force that she noted and set aside. Thomas looked at him from across the table with the direct, wordless appraisal he had been applying to Jesse since the first time Jesse had appeared in the schoolroom, and Jesse returned the look without flinching or performing ease, simply returned it steadily. And whatever Thomas was looking for, he apparently found enough of it to return to his peaches with the focused concentration he brought to things he had decided to accept. The afternoon deepened, and the storm did not relent. If anything, it gathered itself. The light that came through the oilskin panel on the north window where the glazing had not yet been done went from gray to a bruised, murky darkness by 3 o'clock, which was 2 full hours before true dark should have come. The temperature inside, despite everything Ruth and Jesse were doing, dropped steadily. Ruth had the children dressed in every layer they owned and arranged on the 2 benches nearest the stove, and she had draped the heavy curtain from the back room doorway over the 3 smallest ones, Clara and May and Nora together, as a supplemental cover. The wood was the problem. Ruth had known with increasing certainty since approximately 2 o'clock that they did not have enough. The side wall stack, which had looked substantial when Jesse reported it was being consumed by the stove at a rate that the severity of the cold outside was dictating, and that neither of them had authority to reduce. She had done the arithmetic twice carefully and had arrived at the same answer both times. They had perhaps until midnight. After that, the stove would go cold and the temperature in the room would fall to whatever the temperature outside was, which was a number she did not want to think about in relation to 5 children. She told Jesse at 4 o'clock quietly while they were both at the stove and the children were occupied. She told him in the straightforward way she told him all practical things without either dramatizing or minimizing, because she had discovered that this was the way he received information best, and also that it was the way she thought best, and she told him the arithmetic. He listened. He nodded once. He said, "The woodshed." She looked at him. "That's 40 feet from the door. I know where it is. In this wind you won't be able to see it." "I'll rope from the porch post," he said, which meant he had already thought this through, which meant he had already done his own arithmetic and arrived at the same answer and had been working on the solution. She felt something move in her chest that was not the time to feel. "How much rope do you have?" she said. "Enough," he said. "I need something to anchor the other end to inside." They used the leg of the heaviest desk, which was bolted to the floor. He tied the rope around it with a knot she did not recognize, but which had the look of something that would hold, threaded it under the door, and then went out into the storm with the coil in his hand and the cold crashing into the room. For the 3 seconds the door was open, like a physical thing, a wall of it, and every child on the benches flinched. He was gone 11 minutes. Ruth counted them with the particular focused attention of someone trying to keep their surface steady, while their interior runs a different calculation entirely. The children were very quiet. Eli had stopped cataloging and was looking at the door. Thomas had put down his pencil. Even Nora, who was ordinarily incapable of silence for more than brief intervals, was quiet, pressed against Ruth's side with her small, dense weight. The door opened, and Jesse came back inside with a load of wood against his chest, his face so white from the cold that the angular lines of it looked carved from something harder than flesh, ice crystalled in his eyebrows and along the collar of his coat. He dropped the wood by the stove without pausing and was back out the door in 30 seconds. He made 4 trips. On the 4th trip, he brought the rope back in with him and latched the door and stood breathing hard for a moment while the warmth of the room began to do what it could for him. Ruth handed him the tin mug she had filled from the kettle without saying anything. He took it with hands that were shaking slightly from the cold and held it in both palms and drank and did not say anything either, and this was a kind of communication too she was learning. They had enough wood now, more than enough if they were careful. The immediate crisis had a different shape, and she could work with that. The evening came down fast and absolute. Outside, the storm showed no sign of any internal negotiation about whether to continue. It continued. It had the quality of something that has made a commitment. Ruth kept the stove steady and rationed the wood with the precision of someone running a calculation with a known variable, and she moved between the children and the fire with the tireless, unhurried attention that was her specific gift. Adjusting blankets, smoothing hair, answering the questions. Children ask in the dark when they are frightened. Not the questions about logistics, but the ones underneath, the ones that are really about whether there is someone here who will not leave. She sang to them at some point. She had never sung for anyone besides children, and she was aware that her singing voice was like most things about her. Nothing that anyone would describe as delicate, but it was large and warm and true in pitch, and the children settled into it the way children settle into voices they trust, by degrees, resistance, softening, eyes growing heavy. Clara went first, still holding May. Nora in Ruth's lap went with the specific, sudden completeness of very young children, one moment present, and the next simply gone into sleep. Thomas at the back bench fought it for a while with the dignity of a 9-year-old boy who feels the obligation to remain alert and then lost quietly. His head going down onto his folded arms and his face in sleep was so unguarded and so young that Ruth had to look away. Only Eli stayed awake. He sat beside her for a long time in silence, and then said in the low, careful voice he used when he was approaching something he actually cared about, as opposed to the loud, enthusiastic voice he used for everything he was merely interested in. "Miss McAllister, are we going to be all right?" "Yes," she said. She said it the way she said things that were true. He was quiet for another minute. Then he said, "Mr. Hardin keeps looking at you." Ruth kept her eyes on the fire. "Eli." "I'm just observing," he said in the tone of someone who is entirely aware that he is doing more than observing. "Scientifically." "Go to sleep," she said. He almost smiled, which was as close as Eli generally got to smiling when he was trying to maintain the appearance of scientific objectivity. He settled back against the bench and was asleep within 10 minutes, which she took as a verdict on his actual level of exhaustion. She and Jesse were alone with the fire. The storm pressed against the walls with steady, heavy persistence. The stove ticked in and breathed. The children made the small sounds of sleeping children. The lamp had been turned very low to preserve the oil, and the firelight moved across everything with the orange living motion of fire. In a dark room, over the children's sleeping faces, and the worn floorboards, and the 3 cracked blackboards with their chalked remnants of the day's lessons over Jesse Hardin's face, where he sat on the bench across the stove from her, elbows on knees, hands loose, between them, watching the fire. They sat like that for a long time without speaking, and it was not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who are sitting in the presence of something they are both aware of and neither of them has yet decided how to address. It was Ruth who finally let go. She did not mean to. She had held on to the interior composure with her characteristic stubbornness all day through the logistics of the storm and the children and the wood and the cold, and the holding had taken more than it usually did because the thing she was holding against had not been the crisis. But something underneath the crisis, something that the cold and the darkness and the firelight and the sleeping children had stripped away the usual barriers to, and she was tired. She was very tired, and she had been holding things for a very long time without rest, and she let go. It happened quietly, as the truest things in her generally did. There were no dramatics. Her eyes simply filled, and she could not stop it. And she looked away from the fire, and there was nowhere to look that was not inside the room, and so she looked at her own hands, broad and rough and scarred, with small work injuries accumulated over years, resting in her lap. She heard Jesse shift on the bench across from her. She felt him sit down beside her, not across from her, but beside her on the same bench, a foot of space between them, not touching, simply closer. She kept her eyes on her hands. "I know what I look like," she said. Her voice was low and steady because she would not let it be otherwise, but the words had something in them that she could not fully suppress, a rawness that she would have preferred to keep private. "I have always known. My aunt in Baltimore wrote me a letter when I was 19 that I have never thrown away, because I keep thinking that if I throw it away, I will somehow stop believing it is true, and then I will be foolish on top of everything else." She stopped. Then she said I had been built for labor and not for love, and that I would do myself a kindness to accept it early. The fire settled. A log dropped slightly, sending a brief, bright cascade of sparks against the iron door of the stove. Jessie said nothing for a moment, and she was glad because she had needed the moment to finish. "I have tried to accept it," she said. "I have tried for 10 years. I told myself that what I have is enough, and most of the time I believe it." She looked at the sleeping children, all of them, Clara and May and Nora and Thomas and Eli, each of them alive and warm and safe in this room, in the middle of this storm, and her voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "Most of the time." She heard him exhale, a long, considered breath. Then his hand found hers. not in the cautious, tentative way of someone asking permission, but in the direct, simple, unambiguous way that was characteristic of everything he did, his large, calloused hand covering both of hers where they rested in her lap, his grip firm and warm, and he held them as though they were something of value, as though the roughness and the breadth and the work-earned damage of them were not a deficit to be apologized for, but simply the hands of a person whose hands had done important things. She looked at him. He was looking at her with those dark, steady eyes, and the firelight was moving on his face, and his expression was something she had not seen directed at her before from anyone. A kind of grave, focused attentiveness, the look of a man choosing his words from among all possible words and choosing the true ones. "A delicate flower," he said, low and quiet, and entirely certain could not have kept these children alive tonight. He paused, and his grip on her hands did not loosen. "Every choice you have made in this room, in this storm, has kept them alive. I have watched you all day." Another pause. "I want to be honest with you, the way I want to be honest with very few people." He looked at her hands beneath his own and then back at her face. "What I have watched you do today is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, not in spite of how you are built, because of it. Your strength, Ruth, your particular specific strength, that is what kept them warm." She looked at him for a long time, and the fire breathed, and the storm pressed the walls, and the children slept, and she did not say anything, because there were no words she could locate that were adequate to what was happening in her interior, that long-held, load-bearing wall of certainty shifting on its foundations with the slow structural inevitability of something that has been undermined at the base by the persistent, patient pressure of truth. She turned her hands over under his and held on. They sat like that through the deep, cold, howling middle of the night, two people beside a fire in a storm, holding the line between the cold outside and the warmth inside with the combined weight of everything they were. While 5 children slept in the orange moving light, breathing the steady, uncomplicated breath of those who have been told by the quality of the watch being kept over them that they are entirely safe. Outside, the storm gave nothing. It was not finished. It had not begun to be finished. It pressed against the schoolhouse walls with the same absolute indifferent force it had been pressing with for hours, testing the joints and the gaps and the places where the structure was thinnest, the way all the hard things in the world tend to press against the places where people have built their shelters and dared to call them sufficient. Inside the fire held, Ruth held, Jesse held, and the wall stood. The storm broke sometime before dawn. Ruth knew it not by any sound, but by the quality of the silence that replaced the sound, the way a pressure that has been constant for so long it becomes the texture of the world suddenly lifts and leaves behind an absence so complete it wakes you from sleep the way noise cannot. She opened her eyes to gray pre-dawn light coming through the glazed east window, the first real light in nearly 20 hours, and for a moment she simply lay still on the bench where she had finally slept, her coat pulled over her, and listened to the silence. The fire had burned low, but not out. Jesse was at the stove, feeding it carefully from the stack he had built against the wall, and he moved with the quiet, economical motion of someone who has been awake for some time and has arranged not to disturb the people sleeping around him. The children were still asleep, all 5 of them, in their various configurations. Nora curled into the smallest possible version of herself. Thomas, with his arm thrown over his copybook, as though protecting it even in sleep, Eli on his back, with the abandoned dignity of someone who had lost an argument with exhaustion. Ruth sat up. Jesse glanced at her briefly over his shoulder, and something in the brevity of that glance, its normalcy, its lack of any performance or recalibration, settled something in her that she had not known was unsettled. Whatever had happened between them in the fire-lit middle of the night had not become something strange in the morning. It was simply there, present and real, the way the repaired floor was present and real, a thing that had been attended to and would hold. She smoothed her dress and her hair with her hands and stood, and the floor was solid under her, and she went to help with the fire. They had the stove fully stoked and the room warming properly before the children began to wake, which meant breakfast could happen in something approaching order, and Ruth had beans and hard bread and the last of the dried apple on the table by the time all five were sufficiently conscious to sit upright and receive food. She watched them eat with the particular quality of attention she brought to this specific task every morning, the silent nutritional accounting of a woman who had learned to track these things carefully, and she saw that they were all right. Cold, stiff, slightly bewildered by the events of the previous day, but fundamentally, essentially, all right. Thomas ate everything on his plate without being reminded, which was a development. May had fallen asleep again with her spoon in her hand, propped against Clara's shoulder with the serene unconsciousness of the very young. Nora had organized her beans into a pattern on her plate that appeared to have geographical significance and was explaining it to no one in particular. Eli was looking at the window with the expression of a boy calculating depth from the snow piled against the lower sill, which Ruth recognized as the preliminary phase of an outdoor ambition she would need to address before he could execute it. Jesse ate at the end of the table without requiring any of her attention, which was something she noticed and appreciated because her attention was finite and the children were its primary obligation, and she had always resented the unspoken expectation that adult men in a domestic space required continuous management. He drank his coffee and looked out the window, and when Thomas passed him the cornbread without being asked, Jesse accepted it with a nod and nothing more. And she saw that Thomas registered this in the quiet way he registered everything that mattered to him, filing it in the interior catalog where he kept the people and things he had decided were reliable. The sound of the first wagon reached them at perhaps 8:30. Ruth heard it through the silence that follows a storm, that particular clarified silence in which sounds carry further and with more definition than usual, and she recognized the sound of more than one wagon, and she heard voices, and something in the specific quality of the voices made her set down her coffee cup with a deliberateness that she was not fully conscious of until she had done it. Jesse heard it too. He did not move, but his stillness acquired a different quality, the stillness of attention rather than ease. The knock at the schoolhouse door was the specific knock of official business. 3 sharp, purposeful raps, the knock of someone who wishes to communicate authority through the act of knocking itself. Ruth went to the door and opened it. Councilman Gerald Aldrich stood on the schoolhouse porch with the snow packed hard around him from the night storm, and behind him on the path were 2 other men she recognized, Councilman Peters, who generally followed Aldrich's lead with the reliability of a shadow, and Owen Hollis, whose wife had stood in this same room 3 weeks ago and said what she had said. All 3 of them had the brisk, self-important bearing of men who have organized themselves around a purpose and are pleased with the organization. Behind them, at the edge of the schoolyard, she could see 2 wagons and several other figures she did not immediately identify. "Miss McAllister," Aldrich said. His voice had the careful, measured quality of someone delivering remarks he has prepared. "I trust you and the children are unharmed." "We are," she said. She held the door at an angle that neither invited them in nor made the not inviting into a confrontation. She had learned this particular geometry of doorways in her first year in Red Willow. Aldrich glanced past her into the room with an attention that was not concerned, but cataloging, and she understood what he saw, what he was seeing. The aftermath of a night, the disorder of emergency habitation, 5 children at a table, and Jesse Hardin at the end of it, and she watched the understanding of what he thought he was seeing move across Aldrich's face with a transparency that she found in some remote part of herself almost impressive in its lack of concealment. "I see Mr. Hardin is present," Aldrich said. "Mr. Hardin brought wood when we were in danger of the fire going out. Ruth said. "He helped keep these children alive through the night. If you have come to inquire about our welfare, the answer is that we are well thanks in significant part to his assistance." "Quite," Aldrich said in the tone of a man who has heard a statement and is choosing not to engage with its content because the content is not what he came to address. He drew himself up slightly. "Miss McAllister, I am going to be direct with you. The Council has received several concerns over the past weeks regarding your conduct, both in terms of the manner in which you maintain this school and the, let us say, irregular domestic arrangements you have established here. Those concerns were already under consideration. The situation we find this morning specifically, the discovery that you and an unmarried man have spent the night unchaperoned in this building with the children in your care, provides the Council with what I believe any reasonable person would characterize as sufficient grounds to act on those concerns." The cold from outside was pressing through the open door around her, and Ruth did not move back from it. She was aware with the focused awareness she brought to emergencies of every child at the table. Behind her hearing every word, and of Thomas gone perfectly still, and of Eli no longer looking at the window. "You are removing me," she said. She said it flatly, not as a question. "Effective immediately," Aldrich said with the particular studied regret of a man who has decided that performing reluctance serves his purposes better than performing satisfaction. Though the satisfaction was there beneath it, she could see it, the way you can see the shape of a thing under cloth. "The school will be closed until the Council can arrange for a suitable replacement." Ruth did not say what she was thinking. She stood in the doorway and held what she was thinking behind her expression with the long-practiced strength of someone who has learned that the time to spend that particular resource is not always the present moment, and she said in a voice that was level and empty of everything that was not the immediate practical question, "What will happen to the children?" Aldrich glanced briefly at Owen Hollis. "The Council has identified several local families who have indicated willingness to provide working placements for the orphaned children currently in your unofficial care. It is, if I may say, a more appropriate arrangement than the current one." She heard it. She heard the words, working placements, and she knew exactly what they meant, had known for 3 years what they meant, had been blocking them from meaning it for 3 years, and something happened in the center of her chest that was not the sorrow she had been carrying for 3 years, but something hotter and more immediate. Behind her, she heard Jesse stand. He came to the doorway. He did not push her aside or step in front of her. He stepped beside her 1 step forward and 1 step to the right, so that they were standing in the doorway together, and he looked at Aldrich and Peters and Hollis with an expression that was not angry, but was entirely, absolutely without deference. "Gerald," he said. He had known Aldrich for 14 years, Ruth knew, and the use of the first name was a deliberate calibration, the language of a man addressing an equal who is behaving otherwise. "Jesse," Aldrich said, and something in his voice altered very slightly, because Jesse Hardin was not a member of the Council and had no official standing, but he was also not a man whose opinion of you was entirely without consequence. In this valley, and Aldrich knew it. "You want to be careful about the next thing you do here," Jesse said. Not a threat. A statement of fact offered with the same plain directness he offered all statements of fact. Aldrich straightened. The performance of official authority reasserted itself. "The Council's decision has been made through proper procedure, Jesse. This is not a personal matter." "No," Jesse said, "it never is." There was a silence. Then Aldrich said with the particular gravity of a man producing a prepared resolution, "Miss McAllister, if you wish to preserve your reputation in this matter and provide stability for the children, there is a course of action available to you. Mr. Hardin, given his presence here, and in the interest of doing the right thing by this community, might consider offering you the protection of his name. The council would be prepared in that circumstance to revisit the question of the school's immediate closure. Ruth heard this. She processed it with the speed of a mind trained by years of managing complex situations rapidly, and she understood every layer of it. The official face, the supposed mercy, and underneath it the thing it actually was, which was not mercy at all, but an additional instrument of the same mechanism that had been grinding against her since the day she arrived in Red Willow. The town's need to reduce her to something it could manage, either removed or contained, either dismissed or absorbed into an arrangement that would neutralize her specific inconvenient independence. And then Jesse Hardin turned to her. He turned to her, and he looked at her with those dark, steady eyes, and she saw in them that he was entirely serious, that this was not performance and not chivalry, and not the reflex of a man managing a social situation by reaching for the nearest available solution. She saw that he meant it. And this was the thing that undid her, not Aldrich's cold efficiency or the council's long grinding contempt, but Jesse's absolute unperformed sincerity, because she could have endured all the rest of it, and she had endured all the rest of it, but this she had no defense for. "Ruth," he said quietly, so that it was between them and not for anyone else. "Marry me." 2 words, the 2 words she had trained herself over 10 years, not to need, not to want, not to wait, for the 2 words that were the clearest possible indicator that her defenses were not where she had believed them to be. She looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment that seemed to contain all the mornings, and all the firewood, and all the silent shoulder-to-shoulder work, and all the things said in firelight, and she felt the wanting rise in her, the way water rises past every boundary she had built. And she felt rising with equal force and equal speed the certainty that destroyed it. He was asking because he was here, because it was the right thing, because Jesse Hardin was at his core a man of honor, and she was in trouble, and he was present, and those 3 facts had produced this moment as surely as a mathematical equation produces its result. He would marry her, and he would mean it, and he would be good to her, and in 10 years' time he would look at her across a breakfast table, and she would always know that he had chosen this, not from desire, but from duty, not from love, but from the unbearable goodness of a man who cannot watch a woman drown without throwing a rope. She would not be the rope catch. She would not do that to him, and she would not do it to herself. "No," she said. The word was quiet and absolute, and it dropped into the silence of the doorway like a stone into still water. She heard Eli behind her make a small, involuntary sound. She felt the ripple of it through the children and through Jesse, whose stillness beside her acquired a new careful quality. "Ruth," he said low. "No," she said again, and she made herself look at him when she said it, made herself hold his eyes, because she owed him the dignity of a refusal that was honest and direct, and that did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. "I will not have you do this out of honor. I will not be the woman you married because it was the right thing to do in a doorway on a November morning in front of Gerald Aldrich." Her voice was steady. It cost her everything she had to keep it steady, but she kept it because steadiness was the thing. She had the thing, she had always had the thing that was entirely hers. "I will not make you the man who is pitied for his wife. I will not give this town that satisfaction or myself that humiliation. I would rather lose everything than be a burden on a good man out of necessity." Something moved across Jesse's face that she could not interpret because she could not afford to interpret it, and she looked away from it, back to Aldrich. "I will be gone by this afternoon," she said. "I will make arrangements for the children." Aldrich nodded with the practiced sorrowful efficiency of a man who has achieved his objective. He said something about the council expressing its appreciation for her service and its regrets about the circumstances, the language of institutional dismissal that had the same texture as all institutional language, smooth and warm on the surface, and entirely without interior temperature. And then he turned with Peters and Hollis and walked back down the path to the wagons. Jesse was still beside her in the doorway. She could feel him there. She kept her eyes on the middle distance. "That's not what it was," he said very quietly. "Jesse," she said, and her voice almost failed on the word, and she caught it. "Please." He was silent for a moment that lasted a long time. Then she heard him move back into the room, and she heard the sounds of him putting on his coat and gathering his tools with the careful, quiet deliberateness of someone managing themselves under a pressure she could feel from where she was standing. He stopped in the doorway behind her on his way out. She did not turn. "It was not pity," he said. "I want you to know that. Whatever you decide, that was not what it was." She heard his boots on the porch steps. She heard his horse. She stood in the doorway and watched the empty yard and the white, brilliant world that the storm had left behind. Everything simplified by snow into shapes of pure light and shadow, and she did not let herself watch him go down the road because she had decided, and the deciding had to be held. She turned back to the room. 5 children were looking at her, all of them awake now, all of them with the particular wide-held attention of children who have understood that something important has happened and are waiting to understand what it means for them. She looked at their faces. Thomas, who had not spoken in months, who had put on a coat with sleeves long enough to reach his wrists, and who last night had slept with his arm thrown over his copybook. Clara and May, who slept pressed together for warmth and safety, and who had come to this room 6 months ago with nothing. Eli, whose inconvenient intelligence and impossible questions were the most alive thing she had encountered in her 3 years in Red Willow. Nora, who had appeared at her door with a rag doll and the fixed intention of a small person who has found what she intends to keep. She held their faces in her gaze one at a time, with the deliberate attention of someone taking stock of what is real and what matters, and she moved to the table and sat down with them, and she said in her normal, clear, instructional voice that she had been using in front of frightened children for years, "All right, let us talk about what is going to happen next." She talked to them honestly in the language of children who deserved honesty, which was plain language that did not condescend or dramatize. She told them that she was leaving the schoolhouse, that the council had required it. She saw Clara's arms tighten around May, and she kept going. She told them she was not going far. She told them she would not leave Red Willow until she knew they were somewhere safe. And she said this with the quality of a promise, which was not a thing she offered lightly, and which all 5 of them understood, because they knew her well enough by now to understand the difference between the things she said for comfort and the things she said because they were absolutely true. She spent the afternoon packing. There was not much to pack because she had always lived with very little, but what there was mattered, and she was careful with it. The trunk, the 2 dresses, the books, the small store of teaching materials she had accumulated and paid for herself, and that she was taking because they were hers, and she had not surrendered ownership of anything that was actually hers, regardless of what Aldrich believed he had accomplished this morning. She kept moving because she had found over years that movement was the only reliable counter to the specific gravity of despair. Not running, not the frantic activity of someone trying to outpace their own interior, but the steady, purposeful movement of someone who has decided that the next action is the only viable alternative to sitting still and being consumed. She found the letters from her aunt at the bottom of the trunk. She looked at them for a moment, the neat, formal handwriting, the Eastern paper. Built for labor and not for love. She had kept them for 10 years as a kind of prophylactic against hope. She put them back in the trunk and closed the lid, but she did not close it with the usual firmness. She left it slightly ajar, the way you leave a door when you have not quite decided whether you are coming back. By late afternoon, the children were settled with Widow Crane. A woman Ruth had cultivated a careful relationship with, specifically for the possibility of this kind of emergency, who had 2 spare rooms and who genuinely liked children in the practical, unsentimental way of women who had raised 6 of their own, and who had agreed without excessive negotiation to the arrangement, looking at Ruth over the children's heads with a directness that communicated she understood more about the situation than Ruth had told her, and had already formed her opinions. Ruth herself had nowhere to go that night, which was a fact she addressed practically by accepting the offer of a room above the general store from its owner, Mr. Pratt, who was 73, and had always been quietly kind to her in the manner of very old men, who have seen enough of the world to find most of its cruelties tedious rather than inevitable. She sat in that room above the store in the early evening dark, with her trunk and her coat still on, and the unfamiliar sounds of the main street below her, and she was alone in a way she had not been alone for 3 years, without the breathing of children in the next room. Without the weight of the daily obligations that had been the structure on which she had built everything, and the aloneness had a vast cold quality that she had not quite anticipated. A spaciousness that felt less like freedom than like the echo in a room after furniture has been removed. She sat in it, and she was honest about what she was feeling, because she had always been honest about what she was feeling, which was the thing that made the feeling bearable, if not the thing that made it stop. She was in pain. She had rejected the thing she wanted most, because she had not been able to believe she was worth wanting. Not truly, not in the deep place where a person either believes it or does not, and she had dressed the refusal in the language of his protection of sparing him, and there was truth in that language. She had meant it. But it was not the only truth, and she knew it, and the other truth sat in her chest with the specific weight of things that have been known and not acted on. She thought about his face in the doorway, the thing that had moved across it when she said no. She thought about what he had said afterward, standing behind her, his voice very low. It was not pity. I want you to know that. She thought about the coat on the doorstep with Thomas can keep it in plain direct handwriting. She thought about hands appearing on a fence rail without announcement or expectation of credit. She thought about a massive quiet frame positioned behind a woman who was being threatened, not speaking, not taking over, simply refusing to allow her to be alone. She sat in the dark room above Mr. Pratt's store, and she thought about all of it, and somewhere in the middle of the thinking, 2 things happened simultaneously in the deep internal architecture of Ruth McAllister that had not happened simultaneously before. The load-bearing wall cracked, and the anger came up through the crack like fire. Not anger at Jesse. The anger she had been keeping at a managed distance for 3 years. The specific, righteous, entirely earned anger at a system that had decided before she ever arrived what she was worth and what she was for, that had looked at her powerful hands and her broad shoulders and her undeniable competence and seen a problem to be managed rather than a human being to be reckoned with, that had taken the children she loved, the children that nobody else wanted, and called them a drain and a liability and a source of cheap labor, while she was the one who had kept them warm through a blizzard, while the men who made these decisions slept in their warm houses. And she felt it rise in her like the fire Jesse had fed through the cold night, not consuming, not destructive, but hot and clean and absolutely entirely sufficient. She was not finished. She had told herself this before lying in the dark schoolhouse with the wind testing the walls. She had told herself it with the stubborn, quiet ferocity that was her most essential quality. But this time it was different. This time the telling had a different sound. It was not the whisper of someone holding on. It was the voice of someone who has finally, at considerable cost, and after considerable delay, gotten genuinely and productively angry on her own behalf. She sat up straight in the chair. Outside, the main street of Red Willow was quiet, under its burden of clean new snow, and the lamplight was coming through the windows of the council hall down the street, where she happened to know because she had been attending these meetings for 3 years, and she knew the schedule as well as she knew the schoolhouse stove. The council held its monthly general meeting on the second Thursday of November, which was tonight. She sat in the dark room, and she looked at the lamplight in the council hall window, and she breathed slowly and steadily, and she felt the anger burn in her with the clean, focused heat of something that has found its proper use. In the morning she had told the children there would be something to do next. She had believed it when she said it, because she always believed it when she said it, and she believed it now, and she began to understand what the something was. She reached for her coat. She put it on. She stood up with the full, considerable height of her broad-shouldered and steady on her feet. And she looked for a moment at the trunk in the corner, and at the faint crack of lamplight under its slightly ajar lid, and she left the room. The council hall was a long, low building on the north side of Main Street that had been built with slightly more ambition than the schoolhouse, and maintained with slightly more consistency, which was not a high bar, but which resulted in a structure that at least kept the weather on the correct side of its walls. Light came through its 2 front windows with the warm, self-important glow of official proceedings, and Ruth could hear voices inside as she crossed the street. The measured, deliberate cadence of men conducting business they consider significant. She did not knock. She had knocked on enough doors in this town, she had submitted enough written requests, and waited for enough 10-business-day response timelines, and managed enough of her own legitimate anger into the appropriate channels, and she had decided somewhere between the chair in Mr. Pratt's room and the cold air of the main street that she was done knocking on doors that were already supposed to be open to her. She opened it and walked in. There were 11 men in the room seated around the long central table and along the benches at the walls, and every one of them looked up when she came through the door. Aldrich was at the head of the table with papers in front of him mid-sentence, and his sentence stopped with the completeness of a candle being pinched out. Peters was beside him. Owen Hollis was against the far wall. There were ranchers and merchants and the circuit court deputy and the territorial land agent men she knew by name and by history and by the specific texture of their 3 years of managed indifference. She walked to the center of the room, and she stood there, and she let the silence be what it was for a full moment, because the silence was doing useful work. "Miss McAllister," Aldrich said, and his voice had recovered most of its official register, though not all of it. "This is a closed council session." "Then you will have to remove me," Ruth said, "and I suggest you think carefully about whether that is the action you wish to add to this evening's record." Another silence. Aldrich looked at her with the calculating attention of a man reorienting to an unexpected development. He had expected she understood that she would go, that she would pack her things and leave quietly, the way inconvenient women were supposed to leave when the appropriate mechanisms were applied, with whatever dignity could be salvaged, and without requiring anyone to look directly at what had been done. He had not expected this. She could see it in the slight displacement of his composure, a thing so habitual and so practiced that its absence was more telling than any explicit expression. "You have 1 minute of my time," she said, and the extraordinary thing, the thing that she felt with a cold, clarifying satisfaction, was that no one in the room challenged this. "No. You have had 3 years of my time. Tonight I am reclaiming some of it." She looked at the room, not at Aldrich specifically, not at any single face, but at the room as a body, as the assembled institution that had rendered its judgment on her, and she spoke to it as a body. "Last night, 5 children survived a storm that would have killed them without adequate shelter, adequate heat, and an adult who knew what she was doing and did not stop doing it from 6 in the morning until past midnight. Those children are Thomas Reedy, who is 9 years old, and draws horses with a talent that would stop you cold if you took 30 seconds to look at it. Clara and May Briggs, who are 7 and 5, whose father left in May and has not come back. Eli Marsh, who is 11 and who is the most genuinely intelligent person I have encountered in 3 years in this valley, which I recognize is a statement that will not be received well in this room. And Nora, who is 4 years old and whose last name I do not know because no one in this town bothered to find out before she appeared at my door. She paused. The room was absolutely still. Those 5 children are alive and unharmed this morning because I chose 3 years ago to live in the schoolhouse and be available to them at all hours, which the council has called an irregular domestic arrangement. They are alive because I split my own wood, which the council has called unfeminine. They are alive because a good man came through a blizzard to bring fuel when ours was running out and stayed through the night to help keep the fire, which the council has called a moral outrage. I want every man in this room to sit with those 2 things beside each other. I want you to look at what was done in that schoolhouse last night, and then I want you to look at what has been done in this room today, and I want you to tell me, with whatever honesty you have available, which of those things you are proud of. The fire in the corner stove ticked and settled. Someone shifted on a bench. No one spoke. Aldrich found his voice. It was less steady than it had been. Miss McAllister, the council's decision was made according to proper procedure and the applicable standards of this community. Your personal characterization of events does not alter the procedural reality. The procedural reality, Ruth said, is that you have dismissed the only teacher these children have ever had who stayed longer than 14 months on the grounds that I am not the correct shape of woman for your comfort, and you have arranged to place orphaned children in working situations that will consume their childhoods and provide them with nothing that resembles a future. And you have called this proper procedure. She let the words sit. I have a different name for it. The door opened. She did not turn immediately because she was not finished, and she would not be interrupted by anything except what actually needed her attention. But she heard the particular sound of the entry, the deliberate, unhurried weight of specific boots on the council hall floor, and she knew the sound before she saw the person, and something moved in her chest that she acknowledged, and then set aside because she was in the middle of something. Jesse Hardin walked to the center of the room and stopped beside her. Not in front of her. Beside her. Left shoulder, aligned with her right shoulder. The same geometry as the fence rail, the same geometry as the doorway, the same absolute uncomplicated statement of position. He looked at Aldrich. Then he reached into the interior pocket of his coat and produced a document folded official, bearing the stamp of the Territorial Land Office, and he set it on the table in front of Aldrich with a quietness that was the loudest thing in the room. That is the deed, he said, to the parcel that the schoolhouse sits on. I completed the purchase this afternoon at the land office, before Rollins closed for the day. He looked at Aldrich steadily. The building is on my land. The council does not have the authority to close a private structure or to determine who occupies it. The silence in the room had a different quality now. It was not the silence of an institution managing a disruption. It was the silence of men recalibrating. Aldrich looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time with the expression of someone searching for a procedural counter and finding the search more difficult than anticipated. Peters leaned over and looked at it too. Aldrich picked it up and read it, and set it back down, and when he looked up, his face had undergone a significant rearrangement. "This is—" he started and then stopped and started again. "The land office transaction will need to be reviewed for compliance with." "Review it," Jesse said with a pleasant evenness. "The transaction is clean. You will not find a problem with it." Owen Hollis spoke from the wall for the first time, and his voice had none of Aldrich's official modulation. It was the blunt, direct voice of a man who prefers transaction to theater. "Jesse, what exactly is your intention here?" "My intention," Jesse said, "is to open the schoolhouse in the morning." He paused, and then he did something that Ruth had not anticipated. He turned to her, turned fully toward her in the center of the council hall, with every man in the room watching, and what was in his face was not the careful, managed expression he typically carried in public spaces, but something entirely unguarded and entirely deliberate at the same time. The look of a man who has decided that the moment for carefulness has passed, and that the alternative to speaking clearly is not an acceptable option. "And my intention," he said, and his voice was quiet enough that it was nearly between the two of them, despite the room full of men around them, "is to ask Ruth McAllister one more time to marry me. Not because of what happened last night with the storm, not because of what happened this morning in the doorway, not because Gerald Aldrich or this council or anyone else in this valley has arranged circumstances that make it the appropriate response. Because I have watched her for 3 months, and I have not once in those 3 months seen her do a single dishonest thing. Not to the children, not to this town, and not to herself." He stopped. Then he said, "I have spent 14 years in this valley, and I have not met another person I can say that about." Ruth was looking at him. She was aware of the room of Aldrich and Peters and Hollis, and all the rest of them aware of it the way you are aware of weather when you are standing inside looking through a window present but not primary. What was primary was his face, that angular, weathered, entirely honest face, and the thing in it that she had refused to interpret this morning in the doorway because she had not been able to afford the interpretation. She could see it now with the full clarity of a woman who has stopped arguing with what she knows. It was not chivalry. It was not honor managing a situation. It was not the reflex of a good man doing the right thing in a doorway on a November morning. It was what he had said it was. She knew because she had learned to read him over 3 months of careful, honest attention that Jesse Hardin did not say things he did not mean. He did not perform, and he did not manage, and he did not say what the situation required rather than what was true. She had trusted this quality in him from the beginning. She had trusted it in the fence rail and in the firewood, and in the silent presence behind Margaret Hollis, and in the way he listened, with the focused, unhurried attention of someone for whom what you were saying was genuinely the most important thing in the room. She had trusted it in everything except the one place she needed it most, which was the place where it applied to her. "I need a partner," he said. The word was plain and direct and entirely without decoration. "I need someone whose judgment I trust and whose strength I can stand beside. I have a ranch that is built for more than one person and enough land to build something that would last. I need your hands and your heart and your fire. And I need you to know that I am not asking for a practical arrangement. I have had practical arrangements. They did not feel like this." Ruth looked at him for a long moment in the center of the council hall in the lamplight, with the ash-gray frontier November pressing against the windows, and 11 men as witnesses to the most honest thing she had been offered in her 28 years. She thought about the aunt in Baltimore, about the letter at the bottom of the trunk, slightly ajar, now the lid not quite closed, and what it would mean to close it all the way. About 10 years of disciplining the wanting out of herself with a consistency that had come to feel like virtue, but that she was understanding now, here under the direct, undeflectable beam of Jesse Hardin's attention, had been something closer to preemptive self-protection masquerading as virtue. About the load-bearing wall and the crack in it, and the fire that had come up through the crack, and whether a wall that cracks can still hold, and whether a wall that cracks might sometimes be holding the wrong thing in place. She thought about the children, about Thomas in the coat with the long enough sleeves, about Nora at her left leg with the fixed intention of a small person who has found what she intends to keep. About Eli, who would need someone to argue with for the next decade at minimum, and who deserved someone capable of the argument. About Clara reading to May from the book of illustrated fables and the sound of that reading coming through the wall in the evenings, and what it would mean to build a place where that sound was permanent. She thought about Jesse in the woodshed in the blizzard, with the rope tied to the desk leg, making 4 trips in a wind that had reduced visibility to nothing because the arithmetic required it, and he had done his arithmetic and arrived at the same answer she had and had simply gone to address it. Not heroically, not with any performance, simply because the problem was there and he was present and the children were cold. She thought about herself in the doorway this morning, saying no with a steadiness that had cost her everything she had, and about how the steadiness had felt like strength at the time, and that she was only now here, understanding that there is a steadiness that comes from strength, and a steadiness that comes from fear, and that they feel nearly identical from the inside and entirely different from everywhere else. She looked at Jesse Hardin, and she let herself see what was there. The real thing. The thing she had been managing her perception of for 3 months, and she felt it meet something in her that had been waiting with more patience than she had known she possessed for exactly this. "Yes," she said. The word was quiet. It was the quietest thing in the room, and it was the only word she had ever said that felt in the saying of it like putting down a weight she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was not part of her own body. Jesse exhaled. It was a very small sound, but she heard it, and what was in it was not relief, exactly, but something deeper than relief, the sound of a man arriving somewhere he has been trying to get to for a long time, and finding it exactly as he had believed it would be. He reached out and took her hand, the same grip as the night of the storm, the same direct, unambiguous hold, her broad, calloused hand in both of his. He did not look at the room. He looked at her. Aldrich cleared his throat. The sound was an attempt to reassert the existence of the official context, and it fell into the room with a flatness that communicated its failure before he had said anything to follow it with. He looked at the deed on the table. He looked at Jesse and Ruth. He looked at the room, at the faces of the other men who were watching this with the various expressions of people processing an outcome they had not anticipated, some with the constrained discomfort of men whose position required them to resist it, some with something that was not quite sympathy, but was in the direction of it. "The council," Aldrich began, and then stopped because he was a man who did not continue sentences he could not finish properly, and he could not find the end of this sentence that would serve his purposes. The deed was real. The land office stamp was real. He could fight it, and he knew from 14 years of knowing Jesse Hardin that the fight would be long and expensive, and that Jesse would not tire before he did. It was Owen Hollis who spoke again from the wall, and his voice this time had something different in it, a quality of finality that was not concession, but was something in the same family as acceptance. "Jesse," he said, "what do you intend to do with the school?" "Open it in the morning," Jesse said. "Same as it's always been. Ruth will teach. I'll see to the maintenance the council has been deferring for 3 years." He paused. "The children currently placed with Widow Crane will be coming to live at the ranch. We will be expanding the main house in the spring. Any family that wants to send children to the school may continue to do so." Hollis looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at his hands. Then he said, "My boy has learned more in the past year than in the 3 before it combined." He said it to his hands, not to the room, and then he looked up at Aldrich with an expression that communicated clearly and finally that he was done providing the support that Aldrich had been counting on. The room shifted. These things happen not all at once, but by degrees, a collective center of gravity relocating itself. Each man adjusting his position slightly in relation to the new configuration of the space, and the configuration of this space had changed with a thoroughness that Aldrich could read as clearly as Ruth could. He picked up the deed. He looked at it one more time. Then he set it down in front of Jesse with a precision that was the closest he was going to come to a formal gesture of acknowledgement, and he said in the voice of a man choosing the version of events that will be most manageable going forward. The council will review the situation in light of the changed circumstances regarding the property. It was not a concession. It was not an apology. It was the sound of an institution deciding to stop pressing against something that had stopped yielding, which was the only victory Ruth had ever expected from this particular institution, and which was, she had always known, sufficient. Jesse picked up the deed and put it back in his coat pocket. He looked at Aldrich with the level, neutral expression he used for all things, the expression that was not forgiving and not hostile, but simply clear, and he said, "Good evening, Gerald." He turned, and Ruth turned with him, and they walked out of the council hall together into the cold, clean, snow-white November night. The door closed behind them. The main street of Red Willow was quiet and brilliant, with starlight on new snow, and their breath made two separate clouds of vapor in the cold air, and then, because they were standing close together, one cloud. Ruth looked up at the sky, which was the kind of sky you only get after a storm has taken everything obscuring it and left the stars with nothing between them and you, bright and cold and staggering in their quantity, the kind of sky that makes the specific concerns of specific people feel very small, and the specific people themselves feel paradoxically quite large. "You bought the land this afternoon," she said. "Yes," he said, "before you knew what I would say tonight." A pause. "Yes?" She looked at him. "Why?" He looked back at her with those dark, steady eyes, and the starlight was on his face. And he said, "Because the children needed somewhere to belong, regardless of what you said. And because—" He paused. "I have been making preparations for the answer I was hoping for since about the 3rd week of October." Ruth looked at him for a long moment, and then she laughed. It was not the careful, controlled sound she normally permitted herself in public, but a real laugh, full and unguarded, and it went out into the cold night air with a freedom that surprised her with its ease, the way the first free movement surprises a thing that has been long held in one position. Jesse was smiling. Not the brief, neutral acknowledgment she had catalogued as his default, but a real smile, deep and warm and entirely unguarded, and it changed his face in a way that she stored immediately in the part of her that kept the things she intended to have access to for the rest of her life. She took his hand. They stood in the main street of Red Willow in the cold November starlight, and she held his hand, and he held hers, and neither of them said anything for a while, because nothing needed to be said, because the saying had been done in the council hall, and the deciding had been done even before that. And what remained was not words, but the particular quiet weight of two people standing in the same place at the same time and finding it sufficient. They were married on a Saturday in December in the small church at the edge of town, with 5 children sitting in the front pew in their best clothes. Thomas wore the coat with the long sleeves and sat very straight with his hands in his lap and did not draw horses in any available copybook, which Ruth recognized as the full extent of his ceremonial composure and which moved her more than any formal tribute could have. Clara had braided May's hair with a ribbon she had found somewhere, and considered her own handiwork throughout the proceedings with the focused, critical assessment of a 7-year-old artist. Eli had prepared a brief speech that he delivered at the reception with the unnerving confidence of a boy who has never seriously questioned his right to be heard, and the speech was funny and sharp, and contained one observation about the nature of partnership that was so unexpectedly accurate that Ruth had to look at the floor for a moment to collect herself. Nora wore her best dress and carried her rag doll, and at the moment when the ceremony reached its conclusion, she said in the carrying voice of a 4-year-old who does not yet understand the concept of an inside voice, "Is that the part where they are a family now?" And the church laughed all of it, even the people who had spent 3 years looking at Ruth McAllister with the careful indifference of people maintaining a position, and Ruth looked at Jesse and saw that he was laughing too, and she thought that this was perhaps the most honest thing the town of Red Willow had produced in all the time she had lived in it. They expanded the ranch house that spring as Jesse had said they would. He had chosen the land for its particular qualities 14 years ago, the good water and the shelter from the north wind and the south-facing slope that caught the sun in the way of land that has been paying attention to the sun. And now Ruth walked it with him in the early spring mornings, the two of them side by side, in the particular easy parallel of people who have established the rhythm of working together and find it as natural as breathing, and she saw what he had seen in it, the potential not just for a ranch, but for something larger and more durable, a place built for people and for the things that people need, which are shelter and warmth, and the knowledge that they belong somewhere. They built 2 additional rooms onto the main house. One became a proper schoolroom with south-facing windows that Ruth had specified herself, 3 good blackboards and shelves for the books that accumulated over the following years, with the irresistible inevitability of books in a house where everyone reads. The other became a dormitory with 4 proper beds and a 5th smaller one in the corner, each with a quilt that Ruth made herself over the winter, a different pattern for each child, Thomas's with horses in the border, May's with small animal shapes, Nora's with the particular riot of colors she had indicated she preferred by the method of pointing at every color available and saying that one. Thomas spoke for the first time in February, about 6 weeks after the wedding. He spoke to Jesse in the barn about one of the horses, a specific question about a particular animal's behavior that indicated he had been observing carefully for some time, and had accumulated a genuine question that finally outweighed his silence. Jesse answered the question with the seriousness it deserved, and asked a follow-up question of his own, and the conversation that resulted lasted nearly an hour, which Ruth knew because she was in the doorway of the barn at the end of it, listening to the sound of Thomas's voice, with the focused private intensity of someone hearing something they have been waiting a long time to hear. She did not go in. She went back to the schoolroom and sat down at the table and put her face in her rough, calloused hands for a moment, not from sorrow, but from the specific, overwhelming quality of happiness that arrives in the form of a thing you had stopped expecting. Eli was accepted to the Territorial Academy in Cheyenne 3 years later on the basis of an examination that the administrator wrote to Ruth about afterward, describing his performance in terms that were both complimentary and slightly alarmed, which Ruth recognized as the appropriate response to Eli performing at full capacity, and which she took as entirely good news. He came home for summers and for holidays, and he always sat at the end of the table where Jesse sat, asking the questions that occurred to him across whatever distance of subject matter they had most recently been covering. And Jesse answered them with the same plain directness he answered everything, and Ruth watched the two of them from across the table, and felt with a fullness that she had no precise language for, and no longer needed to translate into language exactly where she was and what it was worth. Clara became a teacher herself eventually, which Ruth received not as a tribute, but as evidence. The plain, undecorated evidence that what you model in a room every day becomes available to the people in the room as a possibility for themselves, which was the entire premise she had staked her professional life on, and which it was gratifying to see demonstrated with such directness. May married a young man from the settlement 15 miles north and visited every Sunday with a reliability that the whole household organized around bringing her own children as they arrived, so that the table at the Hardin ranch grew longer by degrees over the years, adding leaves and adding chairs and adding the noise and motion and appetite of successive generations until the original 5 children were absorbed into a larger, louder, more complicated thing that was recognizably descended from the root they had put down in that cold schoolhouse in the winter of the blizzard. Nora, who turned out to have a last name after all, discovered from a letter that arrived when she was 11, grew up fierce and funny and absolutely certain of her own value in the world, which Ruth took direct and personal credit for, and which Jesse confirmed on a spring evening in the 7th year of their marriage was an accurate attribution. They were on the porch in the evening, the two of them in the particular easy silence that had become the sound of their life together. The sounds of the ranch and the children and the school coming to them from the various directions they came from, and the sun was going down over the high plains with the specific extravagance of western sunsets, and Ruth was sitting on the porch step with her broad shoulders square, and her rough hands loose in her lap, and Jesse was behind her on the chair with his hand on her shoulder, and she was thinking about nothing in particular, which was a thing she had not been able to do for most of her life, but which she had gotten better at, and she said without any specific preamble, "Do you remember what you said in the storm?" He knew what she meant. "Yes," he said, "a delicate flower couldn't have kept those children alive." She said it quietly to the evening, not to him particularly. She had said it to herself many times over the 7 years since the storm. Not as a reassurance, not the way you repeat a thing you need to be talked into believing, but the way you return to a true thing, the way you come back to something that orients you when the world has moved around you. "Yes," he said again. She looked at the sun going down. She looked at the school, with its south-facing windows, and at the barn, where Thomas was working with the horses, and at the road where Clara and May could be seen coming back from their afternoon errand in town, and at the yard where Nora's voice could be heard high and clear and absolutely certain of itself, engaged in some negotiation with the world on her own terms. She looked at all of it at the place they had built from a deed, and 2 people standing in a council hall in the starlight, and 5 children in the front pew, and she felt the full weight of it settle into her broad shoulders and her strong hands, and the powerful, steady architecture of the woman she was, and it did not feel like a burden. It felt like what she had always been built for, not labor, or not only labor, but this specific combination of work and love and presence, and the daily, unspectacular, entirely sufficient practice of being exactly who she was in exactly the place she was meant to be. Jesse's hand moved on her shoulder. She covered it with her own. The sun went down over Red Willow. The evening came in from the east, the way evenings come in October, quiet and clean, and the stars began one at a time to appear in that vast, indifferent, beautiful sky, and the lamp in the schoolroom window came on, and the voices of children carried across the yard in the still air. And Ruth McAllister Hardin sat tall and still and entirely at rest on the porch of the home she had built beside the man who had known her worth before she had fully understood it herself. And she was at last without qualification or reservation, or the long disciplined management of wanting completely and exactly and permanently home.